we are going to be talking about this. This is Test Cricket, A History by Tim Wigmore. It's got a lovely quote on the front from Jonathan Agnew, a colourful modern take on the sport's most treasured format. I think we can all agree it is its most treasured format. And it is a meaty tome. I'd say it's not for the faint-hearted. I think it's one of those books you can dip in and out of. I've read a fair bit of it. And it's filled with stats and observations and thoughts. And it's a sort of chronological review, but also thematic review of Test cricket from its inception in 1877 through to the present day, how it's developed from really, I mean, it wasn't even defined in 1877. Tim, congratulations on this book. You did slightly ruin my day by making a book that's good and long, because as a reviewer it means I have to read all of it. Sometimes you get a book that's long and it's not good and you can read the first 80 pages and discard it. Sometimes you get a book that's good and short, but you've done the worst possible thing. You've created a really good book that's really long.
Thank you.
And I have to ask you first up, before we get into the weeds of it, it sounds a daft question, but why a history of Test cricket?
So I guess I wrote the book I wanted to read. There are a lot of books, especially on cricket history books, especially on England and Australia, and very good ones on various other countries, but there wasn't really something that brings everything together, which is what I wanted to do. And this book was sort of born in slightly cursed circumstances, having dinner with Simon Wilde in March 2020 in Sri Lanka, on what would be my only night in Sri Lanka, when we made a very stupid decision. We said we're going to have a lot of very good curry on this trip, so we're going to have a Chinese in the restaurant instead. So I managed to go to Sri Lanka without having a curry, which was
and so you left the next day because of COVID.
Yeah, exactly.
That was the tour I was booked for on Friday morning at 11 o'clock and was stood down from 1:30 in the afternoon.
But he wrote a very good book, his history of the England Test team, which came out in 2018, and I sort of said, why don't you or someone do that, but for global Test cricket? And he's like, I've come up with doing other things. I'm not mad enough to take that on. And I thought, okay, maybe I'll give it a go. And 5 years later, here we are.
Well, it is an incredible undertaking, because I don't even know where you begin when you're trying to unpick Test cricket. Where you have begun, I'm delighted to say, is at the beginning. And one of the notable things that comes out right at the start is that people didn't even know they were playing Test cricket when they were playing Test cricket.
Absolutely. So with W.G. Grace, obviously the great cricketer of his period, I think he only plays 2 of the first 15 Test matches, because we don't know what Test matches are, and so the word Test is basically used as a marketing slogan, but it's used by lots of people. This is an era, it's such a strange era, where you get these parallel tours. You get sort of 2 or 3 England polities going to Australia at the same time. They're all saying England v Australia, or England 11 v Australian 11, and they're all saying this can be a Test match. So it's a complete kind of nonsense, and you basically only get 1894 an Australian journalist, quite retrospectively and quite idiosyncratically, he designates which matches count as Test matches.
How did he do that? How did he decide?
Sort of went through the matches and said if the teams were good enough, they would count as Test matches.
Right. So because to be clear, because not everybody may be familiar with the early history of Test cricket, the first Test match is deemed to have taken place at Melbourne in 1877.
148 years ago.
148 years ago, Australia winning by 45 runs. It was against an England side that went out there on tour with 12 players. 12 players, and one of whom, Ted Pooley, was in a New Zealand prison.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because
they were down to the bare.
He was a match fixer in effect, and we can say this. You can't libel the dead, but he was umpiring a game in New Zealand, and he'd taken a bet on the number of ducks there would be in the match. And when he made the bets, the people who made the bets didn't realise he was going to be the umpire. So essentially, a little nod to the bowler, appeal, it'll be out.
And he argued there was no conflict of interest, which you've got to admire the chutzpah, if nothing else.
So basically, England are playing the first Test match with the only 11 players they've got available. Ted Pooley was a keeper, so he would have been the first choice keeper. And yet somehow, they go again the following year to Australia. Those are deemed Test matches, retrospectively. 1880 is the first Test match in England here at the Oval. Again, don't know it's a Test match. And you say W.G. Grace didn't play more than 2 of the first 15, and this would be because a lot of those games would have been abroad, and,
Yeah,
and how were they put together?
Yeah, traditionally you have when England do a thing when they go abroad, it kind of doesn't really count. A bit like Australia now. When Australia lose a series abroad now, it kind of doesn't really count because it's during the AFL season, and it's a bit like that with England early on. Or they send these teams, and to South Africa they deliberately send basically sort of D or E teams because they are sending parties there to try and make it vaguely evenly matched. So South Africa are a very poor team in this period, 1880s, 1890s. So they're not sending any of their best players really, and so lots of South African matches. I mean, when people say the sanctity of Test cricket, like lots of these early South African matches in particular, there's no reason for them to have Test status. And of course, England in 1930 literally played 2 Test matches at the same time. So by definition, against New Zealand and West Indies. So by definition, that can't be England's strongest team if they're playing 2 matches at the same time at different continents. So yeah, very, very odd. And I think it's 1948 is the last time when you have matches get status after the event. So yeah, it's a very, very cricket, very kind of bumbling, and no one really knows what they're doing. But here we are.
Now, in those early days, it's very clear that the matches aren't put on because there's a schedule. There's no Imperial Cricket Council or ICC as we now know it, International Cricket Council, but very importantly called the Imperial Cricket Council. And right at the start, these matches are really ways of generating money, aren't they? And we get, because there are themes and tropes throughout the book, but almost immediately Test cricket has a payment scandal. And I didn't realise, I mean, your book is great with some of the details here. The amount of money that people were actually being paid to tour was really sizable in terms of then.
Yeah. So in the 1890s, people were earning more in real terms than they would for another 100 years to come from playing international cricket. And you talked about England being down to 12, really 11 in the opening test. Well, the reason for that was these tours were undertaken on a profit-sharing basis, and so you don't want to take a 13th, 14th, 15th bloke who you're not going to be picking. So you pick as few players as possible, and you share the money between you, which is basically how it works. And you're playing matches relentlessly the whole time. Australia coming here, they would play 40 or 50 games over a summer. And obviously with some test matches and just paying all the counties, often multiple occasions, and various Duke of Norfolk teams and stuff.
And come much more frequently as well, Tim. I mean, this is the other thing that's really clear in the book, is that in those early years, from the moment of 1877-8 and then the return tour in 78-9, suddenly the Australians are coming back and forth, and there's even complaints, aren't there, in England? We've got the Australians are here all the time. This is absurd, because they're sort of coming almost every 2 years. So is this because very quickly the game became a spectacle that drew enough fans that it was basically a vehicle for money, and this was what was happening? It was suddenly money was being generated in really large amounts, and almost what happens is that the cash cow just gets its udders get squeezed so hard that actually interest starts to wane.
Yeah, because if you're an Australian player, you earn money by coming to England. You don't really have other places to come, so you want to come here as much as possible. And it's why actually you have the 1890s, 1880s and early 1890s, people are saying the Ashes has lost. Well, actually, people don't even talk about the Ashes at that point, but they're saying England-Australia is not what it used to be. The old days are never. Yeah. People are just playing for money now. They're not playing for the love of the shirt. So yeah, because cricket has this problem, it has so few countries, which helps South Africa initially. But of course, you mentioned the Imperial Cricket Conference, so that's a big side endorsement. That's formed in 1907, and there was a chance there, had it not been a run on basically empire lines, you could have had a more inclusive sport. You could have had USA and Argentina, who were both actually very competitive teams at that period.
I mean, explain that a little bit more, because it's a really salient part of the book, is that you just think with very English mentality, the golden age, Ranji, Fry, Victor Trumper, it brings tears to your eyes. I mean, partly Neville Cardus is responsible for this, but also it's what we're brought up on, the canon of it. And yet your book makes it really clear that possibly the best bowler in the world at the time was Bart King, who was an American, came over to England 3 times with the Philadelphia Gentlemen, topped the averages, first-class averages, and it's this link between cricket and empire that snuffs out any chance, perhaps, of cricket being more broad in the early stages.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's Clem Gibson from Argentina is one of the great numbers I found. The only person to have been called up for an Ashes tour for England while in Buenos Aires, and he turned it down.
24, 25.
Exactly. Yeah, he turned it down, and he was a really terrific bowler as well. But yeah, you have cricket is pretty in Philadelphia, really, it's. I mean, they're quite possibly better than South Africa. So they're possibly the third best country in the world at that period. But yeah, the ICC, the early ICC does not want to know, because Abe Bailey's it was quite sinister for it. He's a kind of Anglo-South African mining magnate, and he sees that cricket is an integral way to bring England and South Africa together and to bring the empire together, and therefore he exclude other countries, and that is a sliding doors moment. And if things had gone differently, I mean, Test cricket I don't think would ever have been played by dozens and dozens of countries, but I think we could have had a situation where, say before World War II, we had 7 or 8 countries playing it rather than 6.
One of the other tropes that comes through loud and clear is the establishment, and you just have to say, I'm afraid, racism, because South Africa comes on the scene quite early, and they do not select any players of colour at all, despite having a really terrific bowler called Hendricks.
Yeah.
Can't get into the side.
Yeah.
Despite players playing against him and saying, he's absolutely mustard, this guy's brilliant. Already you have that. There's a wonderful little factoid that comes through the book as well, that we think of the Basil D'Oliveira affair as having a certain unique significance, 1968. Well, there's the K.S. Ranjit Singh affair, which is exactly the same, isn't it? That England decided not to select Ranji, and if you're not familiar with Ranji, he was basically the premier batter of his age in England alongside C.B. Fry, scored 100 on debut. A debut, incidentally, he only got because he was playing at Old Trafford.
Yeah.
And the selectors in other grounds weren't going to pick him.
Yeah, we talked about Test. Yeah, so that's another example of how kind of ad hoc it is, that you have the home ground is instrumental in who gets to play. So you don't really have the sort of national selection board as we would now.
Which makes you again wonder about the integrity of those early games, because who is selecting them on what continuity basis. But Ranji is not selected because it would be impolitic to go. So you then really realise that there's no issue. Cricket has no issue playing against South Africa. England also has no real issue selecting Ranji to play against Australia, but it recognises that it shouldn't select him to play against South Africa. And so these really rather shabby and repulsive compromises are being made at a very early stage. And I want to weave that in with the other trope that comes in here as well, which is, I guess, when I say establishment, the way that all of these countries are run, their cricket is run, is very much along the lines of, right, we have to have the right sort of people in charge. You can have working class people, you can have professional players, but ideally they're bowling, doing a lot of fielding.
Bowling is too much like hard work for other people.
Right, and so tell us a little bit about that, because that again is a really large character element, not just at the beginning of the book, but you place it there without bludgeoning us over the head with it, you simply point these things out. But then it rears its head constantly through the course of Test cricket. You could even argue to the present day, but certainly it's lingering massively into the 50s, 60s, 70s, and it lingers in the formations of pretty much all the other countries. I mean, you talk to us about the West Indies and India when they first became Test nations. They're not suddenly egalitarian and joyful and ripping up the playbook, are they?
No, so with the MCC, I think it's the most establishment figure, so that's probably a good place to start. So the MCC takes control of England tours at the start of the 1900s, which is important for the development of Test cricket. But what they do, I mean, they very much have a approach that we need to have the right sort of chap who's captain, and this is the result is again and again England basically pick a captain who's not worth his place in the side. So there's remarkable stats of the first 10 MCC run Ashes tours, so from 1903 to 51, on average, so over 10 tours, the England captain has that batting average of 22 and a bowling average of 34, and doesn't score a century or take a 5-foot. So you're picking a captain who's not worth his place as a default, and you get into all these
not a single century or a 5-foot.
Yeah, so you get all these grand theories about why England losing. Well, it's like, well, they're not picking anything like their best 11 players just to start with.
I suppose Gubby Allen would just have, Gubby Allen's a bête noire of mine, but
he became captain off, probably
36-7 out in Australia. He might have just about justified his place in the played.
Yeah,
but,
yeah, and he was a great player before, but
Yeah.
nevertheless, on average, they were picking someone who wasn't. There were better and worse examples of that. But
And that does continue. I mean, you can say that this is all about the past, but Brian Close was one of the most celebrated captains in county cricket. Actually, when he was captain of England, briefly, England were very successful, but
Something there,
there's
yeah.
suspicion, isn't there, all the time?
Yeah, you can say with Fred Truman, he only plays 20 of his tests abroad, and there's always a sense do we want him representing the MCC abroad? So
that's another part of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
That Test cricket has been used not just simply as a means of showcasing a sport, but as diplomacy. And is this where the Commonwealth element to it and the imperial baggage lingers for that much longer?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the incredible things is that the ICC, England, Australia, and New Zealand, they ignore the ICC's own rules, because the ICC, we talked about the imperial element. Well, so that means you have to then be in the Commonwealth to be a member of the ICC. So South Africa kicked out the Commonwealth in 1960 because of apartheid, and England, Australia, New Zealand just ignore that altogether and just say, we're going to carry on paying you, we're going to still call it a test match. So actually, some people argue that South African matches after 60 should not be test matches.
Ooh.
Because that's another.
So poor old Graham Pollock would have no average at all.
Barry Richards, no, yeah. So there's a sense, I think, of the rules being invoked when they're of use to the establishment and ignored or adapted when they're not. That's a reoccurring theme, and obviously in terms of how that affects players and captains. West Indies is such a classic example in terms of Frank Worrell, the first black captain with tenure in 1960. Obviously his first series is that epic series. They're one of the greatest series of all time in Australia. But again, so where West Indies have an attitude that they generally tried to have sort of 4 or 5 white players in their team, and there was a real dearth of white bowlers. So they basically ended up repeatedly picking white batsmen who weren't up to it. So until Frank Worrell becomes captain, of players in the top 6, white batsmen for West Indies have an average of 28, and everyone else has an average of 42 in the top 6. So these guys are 50% worse on average. But again, in terms of who controls the power, that's actually the image that they want.
I mean, it's quite miraculous that the West Indies were able to hold their own with those restrictions, isn't it?
And I mean, West Indies' first home series, 1930, they have 4 different captains, because each home board is picking their own guys captain, and they have almost 30 players in that series. So they're obviously just picking the Jamaica side, and with sort of 2 or 3 guests from the other eye. And again, all these matches, of course, are test, even though this is happening against the England team, who's on a parallel tour to New Zealand at the same time.
Parallel to it. So this would be the time when Andrew Sandham got his 100. Would it be that sort of era, 1930s, 1920s?
Yeah, that was a little before.
Yeah.
And then but then in 30, of course, and in terms of what counts as a test match, so when Len Hutton he gets the world record in 1938, and here, and he the previous record is Wally Hammond with 336. But if you look at the coverage, no one mentions that. That's a ghost record. They just care he beat Bradman's 334, because there's an approach that actually lots of people there are thinking it's not really a test match, unless it's an Ashes match.
Right.
So that Hammond is not part of this conference, which I'm sure would have made him very angry. But yeah.
Before we move on to some other themes, I just want a quick stopping off point in 1912, because 1912 is a significant year. It's a time when there's almost a bit of invention going on here.
With our old friend Abe Bailey.
Right.
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
So that is when, led by Abe Bailey, you have the first attempt to bring any structure to Test cricket, really. So you have a triangular series in England between the only 3 countries playing Tests at the time, so England, Australia, South Africa, and it basically rains all summer, and you have all these matches which are 3 days. I mean, actually, one of the big issues actually for early Test cricket is you talk about kind of perennial thing. You have county v England, and it's such perennial, and there's a real feeling of anger towards the counties that matches are only 3 days in England, apart from the final Test if the series is undecided, because counties want to reduce the amount of time that players are leaving. And obviously counties are also there's a movement among counties to have one every 2 or 3 years have no England Test matches at all at home, so the county schedule is completely unaffected.
Because there's no real sense, is there, that the Test matches are bringing people into cricket? I mean, nowadays people consume their cricket largely. The gateway drug would be international cricket, won't it, because of coverage and TV and radio and what have you. But in this era that we're talking about, these games are only going to be seen by the people who turn up to the games, and that the vast amount of cricket is still being played domestically.
Yeah, A, that, and B, if you're a county and you're losing your start, you're losing Ranji or whoever, suddenly you probably have fewer people come to your gate, so you're actually getting a hit from England playing. And again, one of the perennials, I think Australia are better at dealing with that conflict. So Australia, they just at every test is a timeless test in Australia. So I think Australia are a bit better at managing that conflict. And Australia are, I mean, there's all these kind of grand theories where Australia are generally the best at Test cricket, and one of the simplest from reading the book is that they are better generally than England and other countries often, but certainly than England, at just picking their best 11 players in their team and kind of worrying somewhat less about all this other nonsense.
And best captain as well.
Yeah, because they are picking a guy who's in the team. They're not.
Yeah.
He's worth his place. They're not thinking kind of reverse engineering back from who should be captain, and sometimes having a team with a very strange balance as a result.
Well, yes, as you point out, I mean, you've got when India first started, you got the hilarity of the Maharaja of Vizianagram, who really just could not bat or bowl, or indeed captain or field, but taking the similar kind of model to the English model, somebody of a sort of high class, if you like, has to be put in charge, and you've mentioned it with the West Indies as well. So that's a theme that comes through loud and clear, and it can be slightly enraging, but it is just a fact, and it forms a backdrop of Test cricket. I want to move on though, because what your book is actually very good at, I'm an old codger and I love cricket before 1939, but you quite correctly devote pretty much the amount of time to the book as is represented by the number of Test matches played, I'd have to say. So there's an awful lot of your book is about post-war, because that's of course when more countries get involved. With partition, we've got Pakistan and India now playing. New Zealand are playing more regularly, albeit not against Australia because of Australia. And then as we move forward, more and more teams come into the fold. So what were the kind of inflection points for you when you were reflecting on the storied history of Test cricket? What did you think were those moments post-war that really reflect? I mean, I say Test cricket's rapid change. It's up to you to tell me whether you think it's really changed, but it has. But what were those moments for you?
Look, I think until sort of 1950, Test cricket, as we think of it, it's very different, because Test cricket is really a series of bilateral engagements with England at their centre. So I think 80% of Tests until 1950 involve England as one of the two sides. And so England are the centre, even when they're not the best team. England are kind of what the world revolves around. And so when you have actually partition, you begin to create the first great rivalry that does not involve England. And obviously Australia-West Indies from 1960 really becomes an absolutely incredible rivalry that doesn't involve England.
Because of the tied Test match and that incredible series.
Yeah, and that 1960 is probably the first time you could say you have a series that unofficially is to be the best side in the world that does not involve England, because traditionally that would just be an Ashes series, and so you begin to have it as a slightly broader game. Obviously, it's still a very exclusive game. We talked about at the start. There's not that many countries playing, but there are at least there's more happening. So I think from the 50s you at least begin to get a sense of you're not just judging. Other countries don't just judge themselves on how they do against England. You have these other rivalries develop. But of course, the 50s is a turgid era. I mean, the lowest scoring era, the lowest scoring decade in Test cricket history.
Slowest scoring.
Slowest scoring. Yeah. So yeah, we sometimes have this image of kind of Compton and Edrich. It's not always as simple as that, sadly.
Well, also that negativity continues, doesn't it? Through the 60s, you get a lot of drawn Test matches. England, especially when they're abroad.
You have moans about. I mean, the other thing, you have moans about over rates of only sort of 17 overs an hour. It's outrageous. Yeah.
Well,
and
actually,
England, 1953, England basically save a Test by bowling very, very slowly, but they still bowl. I think they bowl 11 in the last 45 minutes, which now you'd be getting a pat on the back for how quickly you've bowled.
But the game itself has become quite turgid, and so is it sort of individuals that take Test cricket on? Because at the 60s there was a lot. I mean, there's always been existential angst in Test cricket.
We love that. That happens before World War One. It happens in the Golden Age. Yeah,
precisely. And you do great work in sort of digging down into the sort of the scoring rates, and we sort of think of some of these great players in the past as being really rapid scorers, but actually,
one thing I would say is there's one of the lovely stat is, because you think as a spectator going to a game, you're not really thinking in terms of balls, you're thinking in terms of time, and Victor Trumper is still the fastest scoring player in Test history per hour. So you do get a sense that actually watching Trumper would have been a really incredible experience.
40 runs per hour, isn't it? I
Yeah.
think you said, but a strike rate of only 67, which is, look, it's not a bad strike rate, but it doesn't. How are you getting 40 runs an hour with a strike rate of 67? You're getting a lot more balls. You're also getting a lot fewer fast bowlers with long run-ups, and you're getting far fewer fielding changes, and the game is a lot more static. It becomes more dynamic as we move into the early 70s, really, and that the inflection points of 74-5 with Lilly and Thompson and the arrival of the West Indies. So how much is this about cricket's need to attract other people? How much of it is about the sudden arrival of great, really dynamic cricketers, fast bowlers, Viv Richards, the arrival of the great West Indies team, colour TV beaming into people's houses? Are you able to sort of draw these lines and work out what's going on, or is it just such a nuanced picture? It's lots of things happening at once.
In terms of what you haven't said, I think one-day cricket is an important part of this story as well. Even just this book is on Test cricket, but one-day cricket has a big impact. I think even from obviously the Gillette Cup starts in '63, but and especially from when ODI start in 1971. But you then to see more emphasis on athleticism, on the spectacle in terms of bowling faster, some of that then just and potentially and scoring quickly or relatively quickly, and that does translate into Test cricket. Obviously, the World Series cricket from '77 is a massive thing. You know, most players would still. Ian Chappell still says, interviewed him, and he says that was comfortably the hardest cricket I've ever played in my life. And
none of them are Test matches, by the way.
Yeah, they're not exactly. And you talk about some of those bizarre matches of century before, which I have to say these obviously do not. World Series cricket takes professionalism to a new level, because with Kerry Packer, he wants his people, his employees basically, to put on the best show possible. He also doesn't want them to get injured, which is why he has this shouting match with Ian Chappell with a lot of expletives, which we're not going to share with listeners now, basically saying you have to wear a helmet, because I don't care if you get hit per se, but I am not paying for you to be in hospital and doing nothing.
That's a form of enlightenment, isn't it? Now, one of the things that characterises your book, there are many things that are, but one of the things that characterises it is that you've undertaken a lot of interviews with different players. Run me through some of them, and also why you chose those particular players, because obviously they're such a vast element. I don't know as a writer where you start.
Well, yeah, I suppose in the research process, there was more gaps. Well, England, Australia are, as a kind of writer, are very well covered. India, West Indies are pretty well covered. Beyond that, there are gaps. Like Pakistan is there's these two fantastic histories from Peter Oban and Osman Samuddin. There's not actually that much else, so you sort of wanted to not just be reliant on those. And then I was thinking about what are the pivotal moments. So I mean, Michael Holding, for example, on the rise of West Indies, and actually the kind of what it feels like to bowl fast was absolutely terrific. Ian Chappell, I think, possibly knows more about Test cricket than anyone alive. He sort of he was been there in terms of as a player, like we saw, in terms of facing fast bowling both with and without helmets.
Must have been a thrilling guy to interview, Ian Chappell, because as you say, he
yeah.
knows a lot. He's also quite fierce and intimidating.
I thought he was very nice, but I have heard otherwise. But he played with Sobers for South Australia, so that was he talking about the advice he got from Sobers about actually batting further on the offside was a nice one. I mean, Sachin Tendulkar obviously fantastic to talk to. One of the things about him I was interested in, did he hate his teammates for being so bad early on? Because it's incredible to reflect. We India now are so good. I mean, Tendulkar, he won of his first 44 tests away from home. He won a single one.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Just one.
And there's a lovely story in Barbados in 1997. He has dinner in one of the many fantastic restaurants right on the sea. India, I think, are 4-0, need 120 to win the next day. He goes.
I don't know where this is going to go.
Yeah, he goes to the waiter. He says, "Can you pick your best bottle of champagne? I want that chilled, and I'm going to come back tomorrow to drink it." No. The next day, he gets out for 4. India bowled up for 81. He doesn't go to get his champagne. He stays in his room for 2 days, and he's kind of completely despondent. Which, the kind of how really mediocre India are for so long is remarkable.
Well, again, because
and we think of it now as just they're never to be the superpower, but it wasn't always that way.
But we come back to the same sort of trope that they were often selecting people on the basis of their status in society. That wasn't a democratised game. They weren't reaching out and using their vast resources, were they? And this has been just a constant whine that we have. I don't want to revisit that because the players are going to be coming out very shortly. So I just want to get on now to what you've gathered from reading all this. Firstly, from interviewing so many different players, is it true that they feel that Test cricket is their performances in Test cricket is their legacy, or is that something that we all hope to be true?
No, I think from doing these interviews and researching the book, I was generally struck by that. And I think actually, had I said I was writing history of ODI cricket, I'm not sure as many people would have wanted to have a chat. I think there is a sense of they do recognise being part of something, and there is they do feel a connection. Not that they necessarily know all about the history, but they do get a sense. And this is why, if you win in Australia, that people know it's such a big deal because it's so hard to do, and that's a problem. Because
sort of immortalises you, doesn't it?
It does,
won
yeah.
an away series in Australia.
And even when someone says, it's the first time in 40 years, people do have a sense of that. And they get this, they're also, Dale Steyn was great on it. Just how hard Test cricket is just to play. Just as you have every part of you, especially as a fast bowler, every part of you is hurting. It's late on day 3, day 4, whatever. You're in your third spell of the day. You have to keep on coming back. And I think obviously they're very, very proud to have been a part of that, and they recognise. I think the other thing you do get in Test, you have these great stories of spinners sharing secrets. So Saqlain Mushtaq, he basically invents the deucer, or certainly the modern form of it. Murali plays against him, and he just asks him, and he shares his secrets. And I said, I asked Saqlain, why did you tell Murali that? And he's like, well, it's art, and art is international, and you want to share a secret. And there's stories about the googly being shared 50 years before, the same sort of dynamics. So yeah, there is I think such a rapport people have across national lines, and you get these incredible friendships and rivalries formed. I mean, even of course with Kevin Peterson when he was struggling against spin, the famous email from Raul Dravid sharing his tips and stuff. So you do get, I think there is a sense of, people feel that they're part of something more. So in that sense, I'm optimistic, because if the players care about it, others, that does mean something.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that. I've got one last question, but before we get to that, everybody's constantly petrified of Test cricket ending, and part of that, I think, is because it's such a ridiculously brilliant thing, but you absolutely know that if it hadn't been invented now, it would never be invented. It was something that is of its time, and we've been able to. There's almost this feeling that we're able to hold on to this gem, which is such a strangely cognitively dissonant thing to think at the same time. In your investigations and in your talkings to all these players, do we need to be existentially worried, or is it just a state that we're always going to be in? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic?
So there's a quote from when World Series cricket's being created about how people don't have the attention spans to watch 5 days of cricket anymore. No one wants to watch defensive batting and so on. This is 50 years ago. There's all these worries about, in the golden age, people aren't coming anymore. Then,
so that's over 100 years ago. They're still
exactly.
coming.
So that's eternal, which shows it has been worth protecting. And it, in a very perverse way, cricket's always been run terribly, which is sort of a source of some comfort, because the current terrible administration is not a new problem. Cricket's always had this problem. But what I would say is cricket does face more competition, both from the white ball formats and from other sports and everything else. So just because it's been run terribly is not a reason why we should carry on and yet for it to be run terribly.
And yet in some countries there's more people attending than ever. I mean, I come to a lot of Test matches in England, and I've been around for a long time. In the 70s there weren't very many people in them.
You look at footage of both its Ashes, there's a lot of empty seats there. A
lot of empty seats for the most thrilling series until 2005. And that just wouldn't happen now. So that's positive. So I just wonder if we're forever overreacting because we're trying to protect something so precious.
Look, I don't think Test cricket is about to die. What I would say, one of the big kind of takeaways from the book is that the game does need more. It needs to be more relevant for countries beyond Australia, England and India, who are going to have their separate series. And actually the World Test Championship, which I argue is actually a very important development, and it's clearly so imperfect and needs to be improved so much. But when people say the World Test Championship, we should scrap it, I think that's nonsense. So for New Zealand to win the World Test Championship was probably the best day in their cricket history.
And South Africa could well do it this summer, of course. Because the players are on their way, I've got one last question for you. You've spoken to all these different people. You've made this incredible tome. I want you to single out one interview you did that surprised, delighted and amazed you, and you just punched the air with glee and thought, right, I've got lots that's going to get in the book from this.
Murali was just fantastic to talk to. So many different aspects of his journey in terms of overcoming all the accusations of throwing and that sort of stigma. And I actually think Murali is the player in history who added most test wins to their country, which they would not otherwise have got. Which is not saying he's the best, but it's saying maybe he was most impactful.
Most impactful player. Tim Wigmore, thank you so much for joining us on the Surrey live stream. I'll show you the book. I hope you can see it there. There you go. Test cricket. Oops, there you go. The lighting's a bit better.
Available in the Surrey shop now?
It's available in the Surrey shop now.
Yeah.
I've started it. It's really good fun. I'm taking it wherever I go.
Hurting your back?
Most of the summer. Yeah, well, I said to you earlier, I was thinking of getting in the gym, but I'm not sure I need to if I've got this hanging around. It's a towering achievement, Tim. All the very best. Award season's quite a long way away, and there are a lot more cricket books to be written before it gets judged.
Some very good cricket books.
But I wouldn't be at all surprised if we're talking about this in 11 months, 12 months' time. It's a tremendous piece of work. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks so much, Dan.